Hello and welcome to another tutorial. Today I'll be showing you how to make Eastern-inspired dubstep in the style of Sahis, influenced by his track Tehran Gunshots. I'll make a sample of the 808 I use in this tutorial available in the description, along with some other bits, links to a free Kontakt library that I'll be using, and some free vocal samples which work well in this style. The full project file will be available on my Bandcamp, which I will also link in the description. Let's get into it. The tempo for this project is 145 BPM, and the key is G Phrygian dominant, influenced by Sahis's use of F sharp Phrygian dominant in his track. And what we're looking at here is a 16-bar loop, starting with the kick drum. I originally made this in operator and bounced it out, so I'd be able to tweak it in simpler. You can see simpler is on one-shot mode, and I've done a small fade at the end of the kick to make it less tonal and tighter. Which you can hear there. If I click on the controls tab, you can see I've added a mild pitch envelope, which helps add more attack. Because the sample isn't warped, it also helps tighten it further. I've used drum bus on the channel, and this adds fatness to the sample. It brings some of the tone of the kick back, and I've used the damp to roll some of the high end off. You can hear what it's doing. Fairly mild. This style is quite deep and crunchy, as you'll see from the samples I'm using later. So I wanted the kick to embody this. We have some EQ8 removing the lowest frequencies and a tonal resonance. I'm using an auto filter to dampen the kick. We can hear that it helps the kick feel a bit less hyped, and this is particularly evident in the mix. Without the filter, the kick can feel a bit distracting. The MIDI pattern for the kick is sparse and straightforward. It only gets busier at the end of every 8 bars. And keeping it sparse is essential to the style. The pattern remains the same for the entire 16-bar loop, or 2 repetitions of the kick's 8-bar phrase. If we move on to the clap, this is from my drum machine sample pack originally, but I've added quite a lot of processing. I've altered the ADSR slightly to tighten things up. I've added an auto filter to remove some of the high frequencies. We have some more drum bus. We've got more drive than we had on the kick. And I'm using the harder algorithm. Then we have some EQ8 to remove some of the low frequencies created by drum bus. And we've added a little bit back to the top as well. There's a big difference with the processing on and off. We listen in the mix. For the clap pattern, it's just playing on the third beat of the bar every time. I've applied a groove to all the drums, aside from the kick. This rumba bongo pattern from Ableton's core library. If we go back to the clap and we commit the groove, doesn't affect the clap very much, but it is really useful in terms of humanizing the hi-hats. I'm zoomed in here and you can see that it does take the claps a tiny bit off the grids. For the hi-hat, it's sort of in between a hi-hat and a shaker. I've increased the attack in simpler and added some subtle drum bus. We've also got it on one voice, so multiple hats aren't triggering at the same time, helping to add to the sense of minimalism, which is important for this style. I've added some EQ to remove some of the low end. A resonant frequency. And some noisy top end. For the MIDI pattern, for the first 8 bars, the pattern is grounded in 8th notes. With some 16th notes sprinkled in. And for the second 8 bars, we have pure 16th notes. If I commit the groove, you can see how much it alters and humanizes the pattern. I wanted to spice up the drums with something a bit different, so I've added a tabla. I'm aware that the track I'm referencing includes Iranian or Farsi elements. However, I've gone for a more Indian vibe here, but these are obviously two different cultures. I'm pretty sure Sahis uses some Indian style instrumentation as well, and I've made the best of what is available to me. I've used the Kontakt India Discovery Series tabla, which is available in Native Instruments Complete. I've selected the Vintage Sound preset, but you could use tabla samples from Splice or anywhere else. I've chosen 2 different samples here for some variation. I've made sure these samples are in tune using Spectrum. You can see it's hitting a G. More drum bus, very similar settings to the clap, and it helps age the samples. Some EQ8 to remove low frequencies to leave room for the kick and bass, and some utility bass monoing to make sure the low part of the sound is mono compatible for club contexts. The MIDI pattern the tabla plays is sparse and augments the rest of the drums. A sense of space is essential for this style due to its relation to dub music, and we'll see this with some of the dubbier sounds later. I'll just solo the drums. All the drums, aside from the kick, have reverb applied on send A using an edited version of the empty club preset with some EQ before to ensure the reverb isn't too muddy or bright. And now for the 808. First thing I have here is a pitch MIDI effect to ensure that I can play using the middle octave. I'm using operator here. We've got 2 layers, and this patch is a single oscillator sine wave. This is the sub layer. The amp envelope is important here. I prefer to take the sustain all the way down and use the decay and release in conjunction with the MIDI note length to get the sound I'm after. We have pitch modulation, which is what creates the sound's attack. And if I turn it on and off, you can hear what I mean. I'll tweak the initial, peak, and decay values, keeping the initial and the peak the same. You'll also want to go to what I think I'd call the global tab and make sure the synth is on one voice, because we don't want different bass notes overlapping and phasing with one another. Then we have some heavy compression to make sure the kick sustains. And some EQ3 to make sure we only have the frequencies below 120 hertz. This value can be a bit arbitrary, but anything above 80 hertz is fine. I just like to avoid any muddiness between 100 and 120 hertz. And for the top layer, you can see I've turned it down by 8 dB because of the volume added by the saturation in this chain. The only difference between the two patches inside of Operator is that I've added a filter with some soft shaper drive applied using the MS2 filter. There's some saturation as well as an EQ3 to filter out the lowest frequencies so the bass isn't overwhelming. As you may have heard, the saturation helps elongate the sound like the compression does for the sub, and gives the mid-range more weight, helping the 808 stand out in the mix. After the instrument rack, I've added an EQ8 and cut out the frequencies below the fundamental of the lowest note in the pattern, which is F1. Then we have an auto filter, getting rid of the nasty high frequencies created by the distortion. And the final part of the chain is this sub sidechain rack, which is from my New Lang video. I'll link this rack in the description. It splits the frequencies with an EQ3 and allows me to sidechain just the sub frequencies and a little bit above. As for the MIDI, it's a straightforward 8-bar loop that repeats twice. It doesn't play the same pattern as the kick. It's a bit less busy. We'll listen to the kick and the bass together. The bass line is mainly two notes, G and F, but it uses a few more from the G Phrygian dominant scale, G sharp and B. You've also got a little bit of the channel sent to the reverb on return A. Now for the strings. I'll look at the individual channels first and then the bus. Going to look at strings 2. All the string samples from this project are from a free Kontakt library from CryptoCypher called Bollywood Harmoniums. I am aware a harmonium isn't a stringed instrument, but I'm going to call these strings anyway. The only change I've made here is to tune the instrument up one semitone. The pack has wildly different samples and pitches for each MIDI note, so I just experimented until I found something that worked. I'll just play the strings with the bass line. Strings 1 is from the same pack, but I froze it at a later part of the sample. And I've pitched it down by 3 semitones using the Complex Pro algorithm to try and maintain the original sample's texture. Sampling is hugely important to this style of dubstep, and these samples help the track feel authentic. For the strings main bus, I've added some grit using a saturator. EQ'd out some low, muddy, and woody frequencies. And I've boosted at 3 kilohertz to help the strings stand out in the mix. Hopefully you can hear the difference when I take all the processing off. There's some bass monoing because these samples have reverb on by default, and I wanted to make sure the lower part of the sound was mono compatible. We have some chorus, which is subtle, and another way of making the sound feel a little bit dated. We also have some of the signal being sent to send B, which is a quarter note delay. The tanpura is playing the root note of the track every 4 bars. As with the tabla, this is from the India Discovery Kontakt pack. And again, we're using a vintage EQ preset. Make sure to change the scale to chromatic as well. Otherwise, your MIDI notes will only conform to predetermined scales. The chain applied is very similar to the strings bus. However, there's some drum bus. With dampening applied and an EQ8 to remove all but the highest frequencies. If I turn the EQ off in the mix, you can hear that the tanpura interferes with the other instruments. You can also see bass mono and chorus. And as with the strings, we have delay applied on send B. Onto the sitar, which only plays for the second 8 bars of the loop. Again, the Indian Discovery Kontakt pack, vintage EQ preset, and chromatic scale selected. You may have noticed the arpeggiator before the instrument, and the reason I'm using this is that the gate function is a great way to control what could be considered the ADSR of the sound. I'll tweak it and you can hear what I mean. I'm using a lower percentage to keep things more staccato and controlled, which is nice because it contrasts the more legato harmonium. We have more saturator and drum bus, some EQ8, removing unwanted frequencies in the mid-range, which take attention away from the main melody. And the sitar's a bit more like ear candy, I suppose. Again, we have more bass mono, and we have much heavier chorusing, which I heard on the sitar or sitar-like instrument in the reference track. And again, we have some signal being sent to delay send B. I noticed some dubbed out melodic instrumentation in Tehran gunshots, so I thought I'd create an FX sitar. It's the same preset in the same library as the previous instrument, but this time we've turned the gate on the arpeggiator to 1%, so it's super tight. Again, saturator and drum bus. This time we have some delay on the channel with a high feedback rate and the dry wet set somewhere in the middle. Then we have a couple of different auto filters sweeping the sound around. I've set the filter type, amount, and rate differently on each filter. The first is a bandpass and the second is a low pass. We have the same EQ from the previous instance of the instrument and the same bass mono and chorus. Just playing them together. If I take the filters off and play the sitar effects in the mix, and then I put them back on, you can hear how without the filters, the sitar effect sounds a lot more upfront, and that's not what we want from this particular sound. Finally, we have these filtered effects, which include the sample used on strings 1, nudged along to beat 3, and some white noise using operator. The chain is very similar to the sitar effects, but there's an amp at the beginning. So we've still got a low pass filter and a bandpass filter, delay. Then we have a static auto filter and an EQ8 at the end, cutting out all but the highest frequencies. We've also got this sent to the reverb as well. If I solo both effects elements, you can hear how they help add dubby atmospheres, so essential to this type of dubstep. And that's it. Hope you found this informative, and the full project is available below. I did initially have a vocal in this project, but I couldn't get it to fit. However, I have linked the free library where I got it from, and maybe you'll have more luck than I did. Any questions, please leave them in the comments, and feel free to request other artists for future videos. Thanks for watching and supporting, and I'll see you next time.